contract, but do you have a transaction or document checklist for your agents that you use?
There is one you can in Desk. So you can go, you mean something that says all of the documents that are required in a transaction?
Yes.
Let me show you really quickly.
I might have it because I was I was making my own list and then kind of checking on that, but it's got a lot of things, right? The transaction reference document.
Yes. Yeah, it's got a lot of things, and it's, yep, that's it.
And where do you find that? In Desk?
Yes, you can find it in Desk, and if you put in, I believe if you put in transaction checklist into the search bar in Desk, it will bring it up.
Because I know they have it in Homebase when you're working on a transaction. You can get your action items or that checklist.
Yeah, for some reason that checklist is, both of those checklists are just hard for me to focus on. So I've made my own with little check boxes.
Oh, that's good.
And yeah. And then the other thing is most of the documents that you're going to need for a transaction, when you use the global purchase, those documents are going to be in there. So that's another way to know what documents you need. But I agree with you, the reference, the checklist reference, it has every document in the world in there, and you need something more pared down.
Yeah. So okay, I just thought I'd ask, but
another thing for you to reference on CAR. So if you go to car.org and you type in disclosures, you can pull up a disclosure chart, which I find very helpful. So if ever I'm wondering, do I need this disclosure for this transaction, it will tell you if the disclosure is required or not for every type of transaction that you have. So that's one that I reference quite a bit.
What was that one called? Car.org.
And then put in disclosure chart.
Disclosure chart.
I rely on my transaction coordinator too much for that. I need to follow along with my own checklist.
That's what I wanted to do. I just want to be sure, you know.
Yeah.
Because I got my checklist back from Homebase and there were a couple of things missing. I was like, oh, I didn't know. So.
Yeah, and with Homebase, really for that to be effective, you want to make sure you send them your prelim, your MLS sheet, obviously the contract, any addendums, and each time they get something like that, they pare down that long list of everything they could think that you might need, and they refine it so that towards the end of the transaction, you should really just see what's needed for your particular transaction. But they need those basic elements in order to pare it down.
Right.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
It is not an easy process. I agree with you 100%, though. It's like, just tell me what's happening! Anyway, that's how a crazy lady would react. So, which happens to be me. Okay, let's talk about the counter offer, and then we'll talk about the multiple counter offer, because we're seeing that quite a bit, right? Aren't we? So let me share my screen. That's interesting. All right. Are you seeing? Uh-oh, I didn't want that to happen.
Yeah.
Hold on. Let me just get all my screens the way I like them. Come on. Okay. All right. Seller counter offer, right? So seems like really easy, makes sense, but let's dig into it. So you wrote your offer and you had your fingers crossed. You didn't exactly get accepted, but you got a counter offer. So if you've got a seller counter offer and not a multiple counter offer, then you can be really excited because you're the only one, they haven't countered anyone else. So when you get your counteroffer, the first thing you want to look at, is it a multiple counteroffer or is it just a regular seller counteroffer that's just to you? When you have a counteroffer that's just to you, As soon as you sign it, if you accept all the terms, then as long as you're within the expiration period, you're in contract, you have an agreement, you're moving forward. All right. By your client signing at the bottom, that means, yes, we agree and we are in escrow. So you do want to move pretty quickly on this, because what you should know is that even though they countered you with a single counter offer, they could later on get another offer and accept that offer either outright or counter that offer and get into contract with the folks. So know that when you receive a counteroffer, the clock doesn't stop, the marketing doesn't stop. They can still continue to take other offers and accept another offer, even though your counteroffer is out there. So you want to act quickly whenever you get a counteroffer.
Can I ask a question about that? So
Yeah.
I didn't know that was the case. So if I have a counteroffer in hand and I thought that it held the property for that time period until it expires.
No. So I'm
No.
glad you're in this class.
Interesting.
Yeah. So they can still continue to market the property and take other offers while you're making up your mind.
Wow. Okay.
So the counteroffer can be to the purchase agreement, or it could be to the buyer's counteroffer, as in the situation where they've countered you, the buyer's countered back, and now they're countering again. Or it could be to something else. Perhaps they agree to all the terms of the offer, but let's say they didn't agree to the SIP, the seller in possession. Or let's say they didn't agree to the contingency for the buyer to find another property, or for the buyer to sell their property, is what I meant to say. So they could be countering a specific form, right? Not just the actual purchase agreement, but perhaps an attachment to the purchase agreement. And then they would put the items that they wanted to change on this form, and it would be specific to that particular document. So it says, terms and conditions of the above reference document are accepted subject to the following. So the first thing that it talks about, it says paragraphs in the offer that require initials, and those are going to be where we are talking about the liquidated damages clause, right? Remember the liquidated damages clause where the buyer and seller have to initial, or arbitration. Those are the two options in the contract that require both parties to initial. So those things that are not initialed by both parties are automatically excluded from the final agreement unless specific referenced in this document. So whenever you have a mismatch or a misagreement on liquidated damages or arbitration, when you have a counter offer, whether single or multiple, it automatically eliminates that from the contract. Unless, let's say for instance, the seller wanted it, but the buyer didn't, the seller could counter and say, I do want liquidated damages to be part of the contract. And now it's up to the buyer to say, well, okay, I accept that and I'm going to make it a part of the contract. But if no mention is made of it, it's automatically eliminated from the contract. The next thing it says, unless otherwise agreed in writing, the down payment and loan amounts are automatically adjusted. So if you were planning to put 20% down and your purchase price was $400,000, if you raise the price to $410,000, then they're going to expect that you put 20% of that amount. Okay, so that automatically happens whenever you're increasing or decreasing any amounts in the contract. The deposit, however, stays the same and unchanged. So they don't automatically adjust the percentage of the deposit, but they do down payment. Now where it says other terms is where you're going to put only the items that you want to change from the original contract or the original document that you're countering. So you could say, for instance, you know, a different price or a different close of escrow date, or hey, I'm not going to pay for the inspections that you asked me to pay for, or whatever you found in the contract that the seller didn't agree with. They would list any of those items that they wanted to change and be very specific. It's always a good idea to reference the section of the contract that you're speaking to and to be as clear as possible. I see some counter offers that are very vague, Be as clear as you can, especially if you're talking about something like items included or excluded in the contract. You want to reference that section and be really clear to pinpoint exactly what you're talking about. If it's price, it's price. If it's close of escrow, it's close of escrow. Something like closing costs, you just want to be real clear that it's for closing, it's the seller to credit the buyer for closing costs, that kind of thing, and the amount, and make sure that you have all that correct. I always like to finish it with all other terms to remain the same. It's kind of like drawing a line on your check. You know, you write $150,000, 00, and then you draw a line all the way to the end so someone can't come in and like fill in. I don't know if it's because I'm old school or what, but the last thing I always put is all other terms to remain the same. And that to me ends that section there. And so you know nothing else should be written below where I've said all other terms remain the same. Totally optional, not something that you have to do, just something that I do, and I think, you know, just as an extra layer of precaution. Now, section D is if you're going to attach an addenda, which would basically be, let's say you're countering multiple things, and so therefore there's not enough space here, and so you're going to put together an addendum that would allow you to put more information there. And so you would check the box and say, okay, this is attached to the counteroffer. But for the most part, you should be able to put everything you want to put right there in C, other terms. All right, so here comes the expiration. So this is where it's just floating out there until you get an acceptance. However, they can take another offer. So the seller's counteroffer shall be deemed revoked, and the deposits, if any, shall be returned unless by 5 p.m. on the third day it's signed. If more than one signature, the last signature is when the clock stops, and a copy is delivered to the seller, and it's personally received by the seller or the seller's agent. That's when you know that that time period is up, and if it's by 5 p.m. on the third day, the seller or the seller's agent has to have it in their hands, or else it's deemed revoked. If the seller wants to withdraw at any time, they can use the WOO form. And I like that. And the way to remember it is like, I always think, whoa, I need to pull it back, right? So that's the withdrawal of offer, or the form WOO. So if you write an offer and you say, oh no, I want to write an offer on another property, you can use the withdrawal of offer to pull that offer back, or you can use the withdrawal of offer to pull back a counteroffer. Or look at number C, or if the seller accepts an offer prior to the buyer's acceptance of this counteroffer, right? So that's basically saying that they can take another offer, either a counteroffer or whatever, while you're out there thinking and trying to make a decision. So the WOO is something that has to go out. Like if you put an offer out and the seller signs it, you're in contract, it's done. They can put a WOO out on a counteroffer, but you can also know that if they just accept another offer and never send you a WOO, they can still move forward without having sent that. So marketing to other buyers. The seller has a right to continue to offer the property for sale. Seller has a right to accept any other offer received prior to acceptance of this counteroffer by the buyer. In such event, the seller is advised to withdraw this offer before accepting. Now, it said advised, not required or must or any of that kind of stuff. So they do not have to send that to you. The seller makes the counteroffer on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of copy. So here's the seller. They've said what they want. They've signed off, and now it's in the buyer's hands. Number 5 is where the buyer receives it, they review it, and if they choose, they can sign off, or they can check this box here and attach it to another counteroffer. Now, remember, when you're countering the counter, they still are out there marketing the property. It's still out to other people. And so as you're going back and forth, I always say, if you're thinking of going back and forth, pick up the phone and call and get it all laid out, organized, figure out what's acceptable, and then get it in writing and get it back and get it signed and done. Because by the time you're shuffling paper back and forth, someone else could have come in, made a clean offer, because what you know is going to happen, right? So you're countering and you guys think you're just pulling a few things together. That other agent's going to call and say, what's going on? Oh, we have a counter op. Oh, what are you countering? They're going to tell them what the offer is, what the counters are, what the issues are. And that other buyer or that other agent is going to write a clean offer and slide in there under you. So just be careful the amount of time you're taking when you're doing counter offers back and forth, that you're being as quick as possible and getting it tied up so that someone else can't come in and steal the offer out from under you. And I can't say that enough, how important it is to just pick up the phone, work out the deal, and get it done on paper. Okay, so then, yay, they've accepted it. Now you're in escrow, you move forward. It's a good idea to do the confirmation of acceptance, but it is not required. A binding agreement is created when a copy of the signed acceptance is personally received by the buyer or seller or authorized agent, whether or not it is confirmed in this document. So this is a nice to have option, but it is definitely not required. Okay, so that is the seller counter offer. Make sense? Questions? All right, so now let's say you got a multiple counter offer. Very different situation, very different scenario. Now the seller has countered multiple people with either the same terms or with different terms. And so you don't have the same situation where someone can move more quickly than you and sign off. Everybody's kind of in the same position. The seller's going to wait until they get the responses back, and then they're going to make a decision once they receive the responses back on which offer they like the best. So one thing that people miss when they do the multiple counteroffer is oftentimes they will see it and they'll agree to everything, get it back and signed quickly, and think, okay, great, you know, I should be the winner. They should choose me because I agreed. But there's another agent out there that's going to agree to all the terms and maybe up the terms slightly, right? So if you think about, the seller has kind of made an even playing field by multiple countering everyone out there. And so they've said, you know what, this offer has this that I like, and this offer has this that I like. So if this one would come up to this and this one would come up to this, then I'd be happy. Well, when you get a multiple counteroffer, think about maybe raising your price another $2,000 or another, you know, increment that your client could be comfortable with, or maybe even offering a rent back, or just making it that much better, because most agents are just going to sign off, and you could make yours better than what the even playing field that was just created, right? So definitely think about enhancing your offer when you get a multiple counter situation. You don't have to. You can just sign off and hope and wait that you were the only one who agreed to the terms of the multiple counter, and then that you're selected. So let's just go through this. It's almost the exact same as the other one. When you start off, it could be to the purchase agreement, or it could be to something else. The paragraphs in the offers that require initials are automatically moved. Down payment is adjusted. This is where you lay out your other terms. Remember, this is where I like to put all other terms to remain the same, to draw the line. Here's where you can attach an addenda to this multiple counteroffer. But then now this extra section here, the binding effect, is what makes the seller multiple counter different. So let's examine this. So the seller is making multiple counter offers to other prospective buyers on terms that may or may not be the same as this multiple counter. So we talked about that. The multiple counter offer does not bind the seller and buyer unless all of the following occur in the time specified. So on the regular counter offer, once the buyer agrees, we're in escrow, everybody's happy, we get started on our inspections. On a multiple counter, the buyer signs, and then the seller still has to wait and choose that buyer. So the seller signs in paragraph 5. Okay, the seller signs in paragraph 5, which says they're making the offer to you. The buyer signs in paragraph 7, which says, yes, we accept the terms. And then the seller has to sign again in paragraph 8 saying, this is the buyer I choose out of all the multiple counteroffers that came back to me. Buyers and sellers have no duties or obligations for the purchase or sale of the property. So prior to completion of all of that happening, nobody's obligated. So you've got your regular expiration, which says that, you have a certain amount of time or else it's deemed revoked. It says that they can continue marketing to other buyers, just like the other one did. And then you have the number 5. So this is the first thing in the sequence of events. The seller says, here's my multiple counteroffer going out. Number 6 is the acceptance of the multiple counteroffer. The buyer, it explains that it could be revoked and that the deposit will be returned if it's not done. Number 7 is where the buyer gets it, agrees, and signs it. And then number 8 is the added section where the seller then gathers them all back and says, this is the buyer that I'm choosing to go into escrow to. So this number 8 is really the box that you want to see done and checked if you are the one that's getting your offer accepted. And then again, you've got the confirmation, but it says it's only like a nice thing to do to confirm it. You have an agreement as soon as 8 is signed, and then it's received back by the buyer. You are actually in contract at that point. So, questions, concerns about the multiple counter?
So I have one question. So if you decide to up the ante a little bit, if you've received a seller multiple counter offer, you would do that just in section number 6, right? Oh, 7, just like you would any other counter, subject to the attached counter.
Mm-hmm. And the attached counter would be where you would say, raising the price, changing something favorable in the seller's something for the seller that would make your offer more attractive.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just go right there. So when the seller receives it back, they would sign your attached counter and they would sign section 8 if they chose you.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like you don't like that, Laura.
And no, it's okay. And if you're representing the seller and not everyone has sent their response or acceptance back, but one person up the ante, you can go ahead and agree to that without waiting for everyone else to make a decision about whether or not they're going to accept.
Correct. You could. I don't know that it would necessarily be in the seller's best interest to move too quickly when you have, other people out there that could, maybe,
Mm-hmm. Up it even more.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is the multiple counter and counter. And then you also have the buyer's counter, right? So buyer could counter the seller's terms, upping the ante, or perhaps saying, I agree to that, but I think you're a little outrageous. I'm not going to go 500,000. I'll go 495, and so this is going to be the same thing. It's usually a counter to the seller's counter because remember the buyer made the offer, the seller countered the offer, and now the buyer's countering the seller's either single offer or counter offer. And same thing as with everything else. It looks exactly the same as those other ones, except for fewer options. You've got your expiration, you've got the buyer's ability to sign off, and then the seller's agreement that they agree. And again, yeah, it would be nice if you confirm it, but you don't have to. So that's the buyer's counteroffer. Let's look at the backup offer addendum. This is one of my favorite documents right now. Whenever there's a huge buying frenzy and we've got all of these multiple counteroffers, this backup offer addendum can be your best friend because many times people get caught up in the buying frenzy, and especially if they've been rejected on other homes, they'll go and stretch themselves beyond where they feel comfortable in order to get an offer accepted. And right around the time they go to the home inspection, reality hits and they say to themselves, I'm paying what for what, and they'll start to say, I really am not, just the little things about the property that had they paid a reasonable price for it, reasonable in their mind, would not be a big deal. But if they're paying $25,000 over asking, then they expect this house to be perfect, right? And so they will more easily back out. You see more homes fall out of escrow when you have a lot of competition because people overextend themselves. Even if they financially can do it, they just don't, the value is not there in their mind. And so oftentimes these properties come back on the market. Now, if you, let's say you failed at the counteroffer or you failed at any of these, you still can come back and use the backup offer addendum to either be first place, second place, or third place. So let's look at this. So the backup offer addendum is to either the purchase agreement or to a counteroffer. And the first thing it says the agreement is in backup position number. Now, obviously you want to be in position number 1 because the chances that it falls out 2 times, if it does fall out 2 times, you probably don't want it either, right? There's probably some weird thing going on with it. So you hope to be in backup position number 1, and it's contingent upon a written cancellation of the prior contract. And the prior contract would be the offer that they accepted between the buyer and seller. So as soon as that written cancellation is out there, then you actually move into first place and you're in escrow. There's no going back and renegotiating, right? So once the backup addendum is accepted, all of those terms from the offer are accepted and you immediately fall into position. So the seller and any other buyers may mutually agree to modify or amend the terms prior contracts. Buyer may cancel this agreement in writing at any time before the seller provides buyers copies of the written cancellation. So the buyer can cancel at any time. So hurts the buyer none to put the backup offer addendum out there. They can sit in backup position until they find another house, and as soon as they find another house, they can just pull out of this backup offer position. Buyer has tons of flexibility.
So how is the backup position determined, the number determined?
You would just put in there number 1. So you are in backup position number 1. Now, if you call the listing agent and you say, I'm sending you a backup offer, I want to be number 1, and they say, I already have a backup number 1, then you could choose to be backup number 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever. So hopefully you're the first one to reach out to them about the backup offer position, and you would go in as first place, backup offer number 1.
So you should call first.
Definitely. Before you write a backup offer addendum and spend the time putting it together, you should make sure that the listing agent will agree to it. Listing agents are weird people, and they either agree with them or they don't agree with them. And so, for whatever reason, somebody might say, oh, that's not something that I do. Now, you could try to convince them and say, hey, you really don't want to have to go back on the market. You don't want to have to, start this whole process over again. You don't want to lose any days. Let me go in backup. And it's, and then another way you could convince them is you can say, hey, if you are having trouble with your offer in first place, you can let them know, hey, I have a backup offer in place. And that will help you keep them in line and make sure they don't ask for more repairs. You could really try to sell it to the listing agent to convince them that taking a backup offer and signing the agreement is really helping them, right? It saves them work, it saves them time, it saves them money, and it gives them more negotiating power with the offer that's in first position.
Question. Is it normally initiated by the buyer or seller? Do listing agents in multiple offer situations initiate backup offer addendums?
They should, but it rarely happens.
Okay.
They should. I mean, if they were smart, they would say, okay, this is the one we're taking in first place, and this is the one we're taking in backup. And they could say to you, hey, we didn't accept your offer, but we'd love for you to be our backup offer. Would you like to be our backup offer? Mm-hmm. But I rarely see that happen. So it is usually initiated by the buyer's agent when it happens. Doesn't mean never, but usually. Okay, so if the seller is unable to provide such written cancellation to the buyer, by a certain date. So the buyer may not want to hang out for, more than 20 days. So, hey, if your deal is still going on 20 days from now, then, we're done. Or we have the option to cancel the agreement and get out of it. That is really for the seller because, again, the buyer can cancel at any time. But this gives the seller permission to cancel the agreement, cancel the backup offer agreement by putting in a date right there. Saying this backup offer addendum lives or lasts for 20 days, 30 days, 45 days. If it's to the buyer, it favors the buyer to put a longer period of time because, again, the buyer can back out whenever they want. They're holding the seller in place in the agreement by extending the amount of time. And the market can change, right? So let's say 45 days ago, you'd probably get more for your house now than you would have 45 days ago. So if you're able to get a backup offer addendum and lock that seller in place for 45 days, that would be beneficial to the buyer. The seller would probably rather go back on the market because they're probably saying to themselves, if I go back on the market, I could get more money. But they would not be able to do that because they'd have to go to the buyer who's in first place. The buyer's deposit shall be delivered to the escrow holder within 3 business days after the cancellation is signed, right? So basically, once the contract goes into effect, the buyer's deposit will make its way to escrow. Or they can put it in there immediately, which I do not recommend doing. That would confuse, the escrow company would probably say, no, I don't want 2 deposits for 1 property in escrow. So I don't think that would be something that you would want to mess up. Having the buyer's deposit held in escrow when they're not actually in contract is not a good idea. And then time periods. The time periods in the agreement for investigation, contingencies, covenant, and all of those begin after the cancellations, right? After the first contract falls out, you deliver cancellations, the clock starts right then, day 0, day 1, day 2, day 3, and everything moves forward from the day the buyer receives notice that the first offer fell out of escrow and they have the cancellation. Or if checked at the time periods begin. However, if the date for close of escrow is not specified, there's no reason to do the checkbox. You want the time periods to start once the other deal falls out. And so by signing, buyer and seller acknowledge that each has read and understands and has received a copy. The seller signs, the buyer signs, and then you use the same document to say that the seller is providing notice that the original deal fell through, and here are the copies of the cancellation, and now the agreement is in full force and effect. So now you've slid in and you are in escrow, in essence, once they've provided that cancellation. So that is backup offer addendum. That is what I have for you guys.
So the cancellation that you're receiving, Talisa, is the actual cancellation that they're receiving from their other buyer?
Correct.
They're forwarding that on to you?
Correct. As
Okay.
proof that escrow is canceled. And then as soon as you get that, the clock starts immediately. No ramp up time.
Does the buyer have to go ahead and say, yeah, for sure, I want to do this then? That's how it was. So they're not going to have any notice that this cancellation is coming. They're going to think that they can pull out at any time, and all of a sudden, oh, hey, guess what?
Usually what will happen is the listing agent will contact the backup offer and let them know the deal's getting shaky. That's usually, they don't just, doesn't just fall out and then they call you the next day. It's like, well, they need to remove contingencies, or, we're having a disagreement, and they kind of give you notice that it's coming and make sure that your buyer's still around and still interested. Because remember, the buyer can cancel. Like, let's say you didn't know at all of a sudden you're slammed into escrow, you forgot that you had the backup offer addendum out there. Buyer has the right to cancel at any time. So the buyer can just say, oh yeah, no, I don't want to move forward, and they can cancel the agreement.
Okay.
So
The listing
this
agent
is-
would do that.
you say?
I hope the listing agent would do that. In the Midwest, we had yeah, for sure. I want to still buy it kind of form we had to do.
Mhm. It is like that in practice. According to the paperwork, you fall into position, but it is more so they would be giving you a heads up that this is happening. Because nobody wants to go into escrow with someone who doesn't want to move forward and make the purchase. They'd rather go back on the market and find a buyer who's really wants, especially if they just fell out of escrow. They want to know the person's in love with the house and wants to move forward. So,
Right.
So this is your best friend, you guys, in this market where it's crazy competitive. You want to try to push this as anytime you don't get your offer accepted, you want to try to push to get this backup offer addendum. And they may agree to the backup offer addendum if you change. So perhaps the offer they accepted was 650 and your offer was 645. They could come to you and say, you need to go to 650 and then you can be in backup. And then obviously your buyer could decide if they would be willing to go to 650 in order to be in backup. And that's where you would do the counter. And this would be backup to the counter, right? To go into 650, to go up a little higher. So for the listing agent, they have one offer that they chose and accepted, and they could make that backup offer match the first offer. They could do that and before accepting it. So it's not like they have to accept a lesser offer in backup position.
Okay.
I think it's good too, from the listing agent's perspective, just to keep the buyer who's in contract on their toes.
I do too.
Knowing that there's someone in backup position.
I do too. Because every time they called me and said something, I'd be like, all right, I'll tell my seller, but we've got that backup offer out there. And it doesn't mean they're not going to be cooperative, but I think it definitely makes the buyer not ask for as much stuff knowing there's a backup offer out there. The buyer's going to regulate themselves just knowing that that's floating out there. So, yeah.
And also, do we have to prove, as if we're the listing agent and we've got the backup, do we have to prove to the current buyer that there is a backup, or can we, obviously we wouldn't say there was if there wasn't, but is there any proof required?
You could just send the backup offer addendum and just block out the buyer's names. Yeah. Because it only has, it has buyer and seller. I would just black out this buyer's name, black out where they signed at the bottom, and send it over as my proof. Yeah, because you can't trust people these days. Sad to say. Yeah. I know. Some you can, some you can't. So.
I know. People are just kind of crazy right now, though.
Yeah. I think people have been crazy for a while. They're crazier right now, so.
True.
Still just as crazy out there last weekend, or I guess your phone wasn't ringing, so you might not know, but.
I think it was quiet this week, and I'm going to check in with more people and find out what's going on, but this was the quietest weekend I've had this year, so I don't know. And it was quiet for you, Laura?
We got into contract on Black Oak on Friday, and it was tough. Thursday and Friday were difficult. So
that was the gatehouse?
That was the gatehouse. Yeah. We got into contract, and it was heated. Both parties were pushing each other, pushing. We finally figured it out. Then I let everyone kind of decompress for a couple days, and now we're back at it with, I need to make sure the deposit gets in and their inspections are scheduled, and it was tough. So I had one buyer call me because they saw a listing that went live on Thursday. When they called me on Friday, in the confidential remarks, it said that they